Um, we so we have that's Professor Olukunle Owolabi, and we are delighted to welcome you to the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University. Knowing that you've come from Villanova and you have a different Africana program there, this is your sister department, so to speak. So feel free all the time.
Thank you.
We hope that this will be the beginning of a collaboration across different parts, for us. This will be one of our brand bag in the winter term. We have the brown bag, and in the fall term, we have the Knowing Africa series. And I want to thank all those who have joined from different parts of the globe, and those who are here present in the room, the pious both virtual and then also in person. On that note, I welcome you all to the hybrid session this afternoon. And I'm going to yield to our coordinator for this series, which is the Brown Bag series, Professor Samuel Oloruntoba, to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Thank you very much, Prof. and Director. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Professor Olukunle Owolabi. He is an associate professor of political science at Villanova University in Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on comparative politics, African policies, comparative democratization, and the developmental legacy of colonialism. His research examined the developmental legacy of forced settlement and colonial occupation in the global south and has been published in comparative politics. Dr. Owolabi holds a PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame, and an MPhil in Latin American studies with distinction from Oxford University. You have the floor.
Oh, thank you.
I think
very
we talk
much.
for 30 minutes or 25 minutes?
About 30 minutes.
30 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to thank all of you for being here in person, and thank the Institute for African Studies for this invitation, and also thank everyone who's joining us online. I saw some familiar faces from far away. I know my mom's logged in from Toronto, and I saw one of my Nigerian cousins from London, which is great.
Oh, wow.
And I do want to acknowledge my sister's godmother, who's a longtime family university friend of my parents from before I was born, and also a retired Canadian diplomat who spent some time in Zimbabwe and lots of different parts of Latin America in her career. So my name is Dr. Olukunle Owolabi. I am an associate prof in poli-sci and also director of Africana Studies at Villanova University. I'm going to be talking today about my relatively new book, which came out 11 months ago with Oxford University Press. It's called Ruling Emancipated Slaves and Indigenous Subjects. The subtitle is The Divergent Legacies of Forced Settlement and Colonial Occupation in the Global South. So I'll be talking a little bit about what those terms mean, and the ways in which colonialism, slavery, and abolition shaped long-term political and developmental outcomes in the global south. So there we go. So you'll see up on the slide in front of you, I'm sure this is not going to be unfamiliar to people in this audience, but about half the countries in the world and most of the poorest countries in the world have only been independent for less than, from European colonial domination, since the end of World War II, which is 75 years or less in most cases. And so this book kind of takes us a long-term sweeping view at the legacies of colonialism in the global south, but with a specific focus on the Black Atlantic world. And some of this ties into bits of my background and childhood that I'll talk about a little bit, but you might recognize on your screen Hertzmonsu Castle, which is a study abroad. This is in the UK. It's owned by Queen's University in Kingston, not too far from here. But I spent my first year of university on a study abroad program over there. And so one day when I was 19 years old, just starting university, I was in that building in the dining hall. And my comparative politics professor, who was an emeritus British prof from Oxford, was right behind me in the dining hall. And he said to me, he's like, this is my best British Oxford accent, right? Mr. Owolabi, he says, tell me, young man. I said, where are you from? And I didn't quite know what he was getting at. So I said, Toronto, Canada. And he's like, oh, no, not that. He's like, I mean, your people. He's like, where are they originally from? And so I said, well, my dad's family is Nigerian and my mom's family is from Trinidad. And he looked at me and he was like, oh, splendid, absolutely splendid. A real product of the British Empire. So, this was 1997, and I didn't quite know what to make about that comment. But it had me thinking a lot about my childhood and where I had grown up and where my parents had come from and all that. And so, in this book, I kind of take a sweeping, long-term historical, comparative historical analysis of two different modes of colonization. In the Black Atlantic world. One I call forced settlement, which basically refers to the system of colonization where European colonists established agricultural plantations with imported and enslaved African labor. And so this begins, as many people will know here, in Creole African islands, right? So like the Cape Verdean Islands, Sao Tome, etc. And then it spreads into the Caribbean and Brazil and the rest of the Americas, kind of in that first wave of global colonial expansion. And then I'm kind of comparing and contrasting this with the second wave of colonial expansion that happens after the abolition of the slave trade, when most of the continent of Africa comes under European colonial domination. And so again, some of you guys have probably seen maps that look like this before, that basically show the origins, the kind of ethnic and geographic origins of where the enslaved population in the Americas came from. And you'll see that what is present day Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, and Congo, Angola were the most heavily impacted regions. And then in the Americas, you'll see that the biggest kind of recipient areas for enslaved Africans were Brazil and the Caribbean, much more so than the continental United States and Latin America. And so in the beginning of my book, I kind of put together this scatter plot that looks at countries that gained developmental outcomes in countries that gained independence after World War II. And it contrasts those forced settlement colonies whose populations were primarily derived from imported enslaved Africans with those that had indigenous non-white populations. And you'll see in the slides that the forced settlement colonies, a lot of them cluster in the upper right quadrant, which is surprisingly high levels of literacy in 1960 and surprisingly high levels of post-colonial democracy after 1972. And most of what is continental Africa, parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East kind of tend to cluster toward that bottom left quadrant, which is lower levels of literacy in 1960 and lower post-colonial democracy scores after independence, right? I do a similar exercise looking at Human Development Index scores in about 2015. And what you see on the slide is that the forced settlement colonies tend to cluster toward high and sometimes even very high levels of human development. And the colonies of occupation tend to cluster toward low and intermediate levels of human development. I bolded Nigeria and Trinidad because those are the countries that I spent the most time in as a kid, and those are where my parents are from. And I know these are numbers, and pictures do a better job of kind of illustrating things. So when I was 4 years old, we moved there. That's a town in southwestern Nigeria called Elisha. So my father and his best friend were among the first group of Nigerians to get scholarships to study medicine in Canada back in the 1960s. And so after they finished their medical training in Canada, they went back to Nigeria and opened up a hospital in that town. And so when I was 4 years old, that's where we moved from Toronto. And so that's also where I started school. You can see little kid pictures of me and my brother in elementary school. Up top, you can see the primary school that I went to and the secondary school that my sister went to. But what are some of the things I remember about living in Nigeria as a kid? Well, the infrastructure didn't work very well. Those of you who've spent time in West Africa, it's not going to shock you, right? So most of the roads were not paved. There were power cuts almost every day. You couldn't drink the tap water. We would get malaria once or twice a year. We didn't have a phone or a TV until about 1984. At school, there was no like running water or flush toilets or telephone, even though these were like the better schools in the town, some of the best schools in the town, where I lived. I would describe today the school system as still being quite colonial at that time in terms of pedagogy and instructional methods. Although what was interesting was that they were just starting to decolonize the curriculum in ways that actually learned a fair amount about Nigerian and West African geography, history, civics, and West Africa's relationship to the broader Atlantic world. But my first political memories included a military coup on December 31st, 1983 that followed a disputed election and the military patrols and the dawn to dusk curfews that followed. Dusk to dawn, I should say, curfews that followed. I remember the mass expulsion of undocumented foreign migrant workers. A lot of Ghanaian workers that we knew personally were forced to leave the country, first in 1983 and then again in 1985. I remember protests around structural adjustment against the military dictatorship. I do remember General Buhari as a military dictator and the war against indiscipline and disappearances and, you know, random firing squad executions on beaches in Lagos and things that little kids probably shouldn't be exposed to. That's what my dad's hometown looks like. I actually just got back from there not even 3 weeks ago. My father unfortunately passed away earlier this year. It's okay. But thank you. But the year that I turned 7, we spent the summer there, which is where my mom grew up in Trinidad. And this is a town of about 30,000 people. And if you look at it, it doesn't look all that fancy or affluent by North American standards. But I remember even at that time, this was the mid-1980s, the streets were paved, right? You could drink the tap water. You didn't need to take medication for malaria. The power didn't cut every day. And so there were aspects of it that felt a little small town to me, coming from a much bigger country like Nigeria, but things seem to work a lot better. And you can see that, I didn't know this as a kid, obviously, but that the general development outcomes in Trinidad have been a lot more successful compared to Nigeria, both in terms of political outcomes and in terms of socioeconomic development. That's what the capital city of Trinidad looks like today. It did not look like that in the 80s. All the skyscrapers were built after the 1990s. But just kind of thinking about what I observed as a kid, and then what I learned about theories of development and colonization at university and in grad school. A lot of the arguments that I was exposed to as a student didn't seem to be able to explain development outcomes in both Trinidad and Nigeria. They would work for one country some of the time, but seldom both, right? So these are countries that have more in common than not in terms of some of the factors that are thought to influence development in either positive or negative ways, right? And yet their outcomes are quite different from each other. And this was kind of hammered home because I mentioned spending a summer in Trinidad the year that I turned 7. The day that we were supposed to leave, to go back to Nigeria. We were having breakfast at my grandmother's house. And the first story that broke on the news was that there was yet another coup in Nigeria. This was the Babangida coup in 1985. And we couldn't go back home for a few days until they had like reopened the borders, right? And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in this book is kind of expand the scholarly contributions of literature on colonialism and its long-term legacies in ways that go beyond existing literature on kind of national colonial legacies, as in differences between, say, British versus French or Iberian colonization, and also studies that look at variations within the same colonial empire. I also have some reservations that I talk about in a lot of depth in the book about the whole Acemoglu and Robinson distinction between settler and extractive colonization. Because one of the things the book highlights is that the type of colonization that happened in Creole African islands and the Caribbean was also very extractive, right? And it didn't involve a lot of European settlement. And yet there are different patterns of state building that emerged on the two sides of the Black Atlantic that I'm really trying to explain in this book. And I try to do this using multiple methods across different colonial empires. So there's a chapter in the book that uses statistical methods and models to kind of look at differences between forced settlement colonies and colonies of occupation for 90 plus global South ex-colonies. And then there are chapters of the book that are based on comparative historical and archival research done on the British Empire first, and then the French and the Portuguese colonial empires. So this took a long time to write. I did a lot of archival research in a lot of different places, including the UK, France, Portugal, Senegal, Cabo Verde, Trinidad, and Ghana, which did not make it into the book, but I used that as one of the cases for my dissertation. So in terms of summarizing the argument, the main way to think about it is that it strongly emphasizes that different historical periods in which those two parts of the Black Atlantic world were colonized, right? So on the one hand, the transatlantic slave trade happened quite a bit earlier than the colonial, the scramble for Africa. And so one of the consequences of that was that the abolition of the slave trade first and then slavery itself was connected to some of the major Atlantic revolutions in Europe and the broader Atlantic worlds, right? So looking at things like the connections between the British Industrial Revolution and abolition, or the connections between the French revolutions, in plural, and abolition, right? And then understanding the consequences of that for the legal systems that emerged post-abolition in the forced settlement colonies, and then comparing that to the more repressive ways that Europeans came up with for controlling indigenous populations after about 1880, 1890. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do across multiple colonial empires. So just kind of an overview of the way the book reads. So the second chapter is kind of a historical overview that provides the history of those two models of colonization in the two different parts of the Black Atlantic world. Chapter 3 is more theoretical, and so it builds on work that might be familiar to you guys. So James Mahoney is an economist and political scientist at Northwestern University, who's worked a lot on, you would know him, on Latin America. And so he has this argument that in Spanish America, there was an extractive phase of colonialism and a liberal phase of colonialism. And depending on which phase was more intensive in different countries, because it varies across Latin America, that can explain some of the developmental variations within the region, right? So basically, if you were lucky enough to have been a backwater during the extractive phase, and had more liberal reforms implemented later, you tended to do better than the colonies that were core colonies during the extractive phase and then backwaters during the liberal phase. So I tried and put a similar framework to explaining outcomes in the Caribbean and then in Africa, right? And the chapter also kind of reviews a lot of the alternative arguments from existing literature on things like British colonialism, Protestant missionary evangelization, the impact of European settlement, the role of ethnicity and religion, and things like that. I think most of the big outcomes are traced out in chapter 4, which is the statistical models chapter. So basically what it shows, I use regression models to basically look at the differences in a whole bunch of different development outcomes between the 4 settlement cases and the colonies of occupation. What they show is kind of interesting. So they show pretty large differences at the time of independence, so the 1960s, in terms of adult literacy rates and life expectancy. Those are much higher in the 4 settlement colonies. The differences in terms of economic development are much smaller, and they don't show up until the mid 1970s, but they increase over time, right? And then you also get significant increases in advantages, in terms of democratic exposure, meaning the number of competitive elections with universal suffrage was much higher in the 4 settlement colonies overall than in the colonies of occupation. And not surprisingly, this means that they were less likely to have democratic setbacks or breakdowns after independence. And so that generates pretty significant differences in terms of democracy scores over the long term, right? And then they also show significant advantages in human well-being that persist at least until 2015, right? There's a lot of different statistical controls in the models that I can talk about if you want to talk about those. And what's interesting is that those developmental differences, they all disappear once you control for the legal systems that were in place in the early 20th century. So basically, if colonizers reformed legal systems to model them on the metropole, if they did this in the 19th century or the early part of the 20th century, you tend to get much better developmental outcomes over the long term. And you can think about this in terms of the conceptual difference between colony as sort of an extension of the metropole, right? Or colony as an extractive zone. And if the colonizers reform the system to the legal system to model it on the metropole, it allows more space for people to demand rights, have access to schools and education and things like that, that tend to show up positively over the long term in terms of their development outcomes. So the subsequent chapters are comparative historical. And so there's one on the British Empire, and it focuses mostly on a comparative historical analysis of Jamaica in the Caribbean and Sierra Leone in West Africa. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail if you'd like. There's a chapter on Portuguese colonialism that compares Cabo Verde with Guinea-Bissau. That was a really interesting chapter for me to write because of the geographic proximity of the two places, and also the very strong cultural and historical links between the two countries, and the fact that they were part of the same anti-colonial resistance in the 1960s and 70s. This is probably my favorite chapter to write. It's the most sweeping. So here I have like 10 abbreviated case studies from the French colonial empire. And so it starts with the question of why is Haiti so messed up? Honestly, in terms of its developmental outcome, why does it suffer from so many developmental and post-colonial challenges relative to the rest of the Caribbean or even Creole African islands like Mauritius, Seychelles, right, Cabo Verde, that have done a lot better over the long term. And then it compares Haiti's experience with the other kind of French Creole colonies, so Guadeloupe, Martinique, Réunion. And then I take a look at a sample of French colonies in Africa, starting in Algeria, and then working my way down. So it goes from Algeria to Senegal to Gabon to Madagascar, and then it ends up in the Comoros Islands. And then chapter 8 is kind of conclusions and tying up loose ends. So most of the book focuses on colonies that emerged after World War II. And here I try to generate questions for future research based on colonial states that gained independence earlier, right? So does this argument, or how well does this argument travel to places like Brazil or Cuba, right? Or why did Brazil and South Africa adopt such different kind of paths toward like citizenship and racial inclusion or exclusion, right? Exclusion in the case of South Africa, and more inclusion in Brazil, right? From the late 19th century onward. And then why does the United States continue to have the extent of kind of racial disparities and inequalities that it does today? So that's what I got for you. So I'm happy to take questions, comments, etc. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've given us so much to digest. We'll open it up now for questions. Okay, I will let you go first. Kate.
So you said that really all of these differences, fall away if you just look at the differences in the legal system. Can you say more about why and what it was in the legal systems that allowed
Sure. That's a
more extractive versus, I mean, the metropolitan legal systems, also had their inequalities in them for women and other, or even for, peasants in a sense. So I just, so yeah, can you speak a little bit more about what was going on in those legal systems?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. And you're right to point out that metropolitan legal systems had their own built-in exclusions and inequalities in them. So they were by no means perfect or even equitable, right? And I do make a strong effort in the book to try not to use normative language, but to use comparative language, if that makes sense. So basically, I'll kind of walk through a couple of cases. So when the British abolished slavery, part of those reforms meant that emancipated Afro descendants were legally recognized as free British subjects, right? So what did that actually mean? Well, it certainly didn't mean that you could vote in 1830s, but it did mean, right, that you could own property, right? It meant that you had religious liberty as it was understood at the time in British colonies. And there was a very, very strong emphasis on schooling and education for emancipated Afro descendants. Part of it was that the British needed a new way to kind of socialize and quasi-control these populations because they had rights. But a lot of it was driven by demand from emancipated people themselves who regarded education and schooling for their children and British legal rights as a way to prevent future re-enslavement, right? And because people could see that there were spaces where slavery was first abolished and then reinstated, right? Like in the French Caribbean, this was a very strongly assertive way to like guarantee your freedom. And yes, there were people whose responses was to kind of retreat from the British state and to try and hide in kind of rural, remote areas. But there were also lots of people that took advantage of those new legal rights to try and acquire land and education for their kids. And once you even have like the first generation of, yeah, of course, thank you. Once you have even the first, generation of, educated people in the society, like they start to advocate and advance their own causes, right? The difference is that they have the legal rights to do so. And so the demands that they make on the state are sometimes listened to, not always, sometimes, right? So that's one way. And in the French colonies, in some ways, it was more powerful because they legally became citizens, which meant that the men could vote and they got parliamentary representation. And so that kind of changed the political calculation and dynamic as well. So, yeah.
We need
Yeah,
to get
thank
back
you.
to the screen. So
Oh,
can you just.
we need to get back to
You have a
sharing my
question?
screen.
No. I
Oh,
want
go
to see
ahead.
the participants.
Oh, okay, let
Go
me
back
try to
the Zoom-
figure
to the Zoom screen.
that out. Hold on. I'm sorry. So you want me to close this?
Yes, if you close your.
Okay,
screen,
I'm sorry.
you're sharing. Gabriel. Come and help. Tom.
I'm sorry.
Yes, you should.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that good?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
I heard on the radio maybe last week,
Can you
a
click on
book
the-
by
the comment?
Amcia Lubrin, Code Noir. Do you know anything about the 59 decrees passed by
Yes.
King Louis the 14th in 1685 to regulate, or no, well, decrees. When you talked about your favorite chapter on French.
Yeah, sure.
Did the Code Noir come up?
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
just in case, did you see that? I think it's a novel though, Campsia Lubrin from Saint Lucia. She lives in Whitby, Ontario.
Oh, cool. I don't know the book, so I haven't read the
I
book
don't
yet.
know either, I just heard on the
Yeah,
radio.
so the Code Noir was King Louis XIV's slave code.
1685.
1685, exactly. And it remained in force in all French colonies where slavery was legal until 1848. The main exception to this would be Haiti because of the Haitian Revolution. It would have been kind of overthrown and replaced with other kinds of repressive labor systems earlier.
You know, I mean, they just said, of course, they didn't have time to tell
Yeah.
what the decrees are, but can you give an example? What was decree number 1 or?
I don't,
No.
I couldn't tell you what decree number 1 is.
Oh, well, not.
But no, but let me just, yeah, no, they're right. So for instance, enslaved people were not allowed to own property. They weren't
Mhm.
allowed to practice their religion. They weren't allowed any kind of self-defense. They were not allowed to be educated. They couldn't inherit. White planters and managers could use almost lethal levels of punishment against enslaved people.
And this was
and
by law.
This was
written
by
down
law written down in the
in
law, yeah,
France.
in France, and then applied to colonies, right? The British colonies had their equivalents. The only difference is that in British colonies, they differed a little bit from colony to colony. So the British slave codes in Jamaica and Barbados are some of the older ones. They were then more or less copied by colonies like South Carolina, right, Georgia, Virginia, a little bit later in the 1600s. So everyone was roughly doing the same thing, and what they were doing was awful. There is some variation in terms of when abolition happened when it happened over time and what the driving forces of it were. So that's kind of discussed throughout the book.
Yes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing is, you know, that when you put something into law, there it is written and you
Yeah.
can't really remove it. I mean, like, nobody can deny it.
Precisely, but they were removed. Once slavery was abolished, those slave codes were also abolished. And this
Without
happens in the
record,
19th century.
without record.
So
I
what?
mean, obviously, they might be off the books
Yeah.
legally, but they
Yeah.
would still be on record as having been, well, I guess so.
Once, as in like once upon a time. if that makes sense.
No, just as long as they're, somebody like a researcher could go back and find decree number 59.
Oh, I mean, okay, so you can look them up and read them, yes,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they ceased to be law
Yeah.
at some point in the 19th century,
Yeah.
so, yeah,
Alright.
so, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can we
Do we
see-
have,
Can we
Pardon me,
see?
thank you.
do we have
Question.
somebody,
I'll see if I can, oh, there,
having any question?
there we go.
Okay, I have to leave. Your link are showing along your slide. Not sure if you meant to have the feeling. Sorry, I have to leave early. Okay, so please, do we have any question online while we're waiting for them? Thank you again for your presentation. I'm curious about your first or second slide where you, maybe that's what I understood it today, that colonialism has some positive development. And I think that is very, it's a serious comment in the context of the ongoing debate.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sure you are aware of this article by Bruce Gilley.
Oh, yeah.
Who was saying,
Yeah.
making a case for colonialism.
Yeah.
But when you put everything together, economic, social, cultural, history, can you really say that colonialism has positive development in the colonies?
That's a very good question.
Please exit the chat.
So what do you need me to do?
Please Exit the chat.
Exit the chat. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So I think it shouldn't be too controversial to say that there were individual people that benefited from aspects of colonialism, right? That is not to say that it was a net positive for the society as a whole. So let me give you just kind of an example of this. When I started doing this research as a PhD student, not surprisingly, it generated some heated conversations, family conversations within my family. And I remember, right, at one point, my grandmother, and I'm not saying I agree with this argument, but she was very strongly arguing that a lot of people benefited from missionary education in a lot of British colonies, to the extent that she was saying, and I've heard this from older people, that certain things were better, not for everybody or necessarily writ large, but I can certainly remember being in London and doing research in the National Archives and getting into these conversations with older people from both Africa and the Caribbean who were working in the archives. And they would make comments to me like, oh yeah, things were better in Jamaica or in Malawi or wherever it was back in the old days. And now we've got independence and they've made a real mess of things, right? Like I would hear those kinds of comments from Black people from both the Caribbean and Africa, like living in the UK. And of course, sometimes I would also hear those types of comments from white British people. And so, I mean, if you read even literature of people like someone like Chinua Achebe, right, who is very much kind of both a post-colonial and an anti-colonial writer at the same time, a lot of what he writes about as a critique of post-colonial Nigerian politics and political economy and society is very critical. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that systems that are oppressive hold people writ large and societies back writ large, but individual people can get specific kinds of benefits out of those systems, right? And you can think about this in terms of the way authoritarianism functions as a regime type. Like there's always people that benefit, right, from most types of political regimes, no matter how repressive they are. So by and large, where I stand on this is that colonialism messed up a lot of the global South in very profound ways. And the way that it did, its consequences were somewhat different by region on a number of different dimensions, but there were certainly individual people that benefited from aspects of it. And I think education is one area where it's not difficult to see where individuals benefited from it, right? So like my parents will tell you, they went to really good schools in their respective countries under British rule. That's not to say that British rule was good or that it was a net positive. It's just to say that, I went to really good schools and got a really good education under this system, right? So that's my answer to your excellent, really, really good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other question?
Well,
Comment? Yeah, sure.
just in link with that, what comes to my mind
Yeah.
is India.
Sure. Yeah.
I think this was already a huge country when the British
Yes.
came there.
Yeah, it was absolutely.
How many soldiers did they have at the maximum there? I think 30,000.
Yeah,
They
it's
had
crazy.
to get local
Of course,
people
yeah, all over
to
Africa.
do
the
it
same.
for them,
Exactly.
so they benefit from it. The British were excellent at that game.
They really were.
They were finding the local people who would do their bidding
Yeah.
and would do quite well.
Yeah.
So that, in that sense, it is.
And people like indigenous populations or non-white groups in general would sometimes have to make these calculations about how are they going to survive in this new reality. It's a little bit like how, growing up and learning Canadian history sort of circa age 12, 13, and learning, I went to Catholic school, so the history I got was a little different in some aspects, right? So learning about the French Jesuits that were martyred in what's now Central Ontario, right? So what we learned, or we were taught in school, and this was in the late 80s and early 90s, was that for a bunch of different reasons, the Huron populations in that part of Ontario made strategic alliances with French, right, for traders and French missionaries who were part of this process, right? And part of this is that they had long-standing historical kind of tensions and conflicts with Iroquois populations in what is now New York State, who allied with English traders and colonists, and both Europeans were supplying their preferred indigenous trading partner with weapons, right? And the same thing kind of plays out in many different parts of Africa, and people are kind of making these day-to-day calculations about how best am I going to survive and provide for what they consider to be theirs, right? In this new reality that I recognize I'm no longer the top dog in this new reality. I have to adjust myself to this new power imbalance where I'm down here. And so how do I best navigate that reality? And that's where you see people as individuals and sometimes as groups making very specific kind of calculated strategic decisions about how they're going to navigate in those in those types of challenging environments.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Question?
Yeah, sure.
By the way, I really like the presentation. It gives me a lot of information, but at the same time, it raises a lot of
I
questions.
know. Yeah, totally.
And, I have one. Look, I'm gonna try to be direct with it, but what it suggests to me is the following. I do have some African experience, particularly in West Africa, Central Africa. I just came back from South Africa a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
I follow South Africa, and it's a very interesting example
Very much so.
because it's recent and it was one of the most sophisticated countries with all the systems. And there, I remember Paul Collier and his bottom billion, and he talks about the poverty traps, and they just don't apply to South Africa. They have the institutions, but they don't work.
They do when they don't.
Because, but I approach that with a special mindset. I've been working in community development, like in India, for about 40 years. So I come sometime from the ground, and I'm focused on the agency of people rather than systems, although you cannot do one without the other. They have something to tell each other. And what I find in South Africa is that the picture was fantastic, but you can destroy everything.
Yeah.
There is not a single SOE, state enterprise, that is not bankrupt in South
Yeah.
Africa, not a single one. And this was achieved in less than 30 years, and it started from very high. And
Yeah.
I have many friends, when I go there, I go to the townships, and
Yeah.
my gut just
Yeah.
get like that.
Yeah.
And what my friends say, look, the conditions, this is apartheid
Mhm.
under new management.
Absolutely.
Under
In
new
a lot of
management.
ways, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a lot of
But
ways.
when I find in your comparison between the forced settlement and the other one,
Yeah.
because also I would like to make a difference between Asia and Africa.
I would too.
Because, yeah,
I would too.
because Asia,
Yeah.
one thing is that you had a collective sense and countries that were well defined.
Before.
Africa was not
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
It was a series
Mostly it
of
wasn't,
ethnic
yeah.
groups.
Exactly.
And the present countries are artificial.
Yes.
And the
Yes.
sense of belonging, the collective sense is not there. And when
Yeah.
I listen to you, the intuition, and I would like to see your comments on that, I said, when the Africans were sent to the settlements,
Yeah.
everything was broken in those
Yeah, completely.
communities. Completely broken.
Completely, yeah.
Yet the Africans were able to come with it
Yeah,
and grow.
yeah.
But normally, most of the colonizers, when they went to countries like Africa or others, it was, I think, a standard pattern,
Yeah.
they would use the existing elite to control the population.
Mhm.
So in a way, a lot was preserved. There was not that kind of as thorough, there was a breaking, but not as thorough and not in the same way. And the groups that had power, in a way, kept it.
Mhm.
With respect to others, they had less maybe than before,
Mhm.
but it was under the subjugation of the Europeans, but they had it.
Mhm.
Because for me, the thing that strikes me in Africa, in Sub-Sahara, is I feel is a betrayal of the elites. A
Mhm.
betrayal of the elites.
Mhm.
And I go in the communities and things like that, and what they try to achieve, and it's not working.
Mhm.
And one thing that influenced my thinking is a book I read many years ago by Axel Kabou.
Mhm.
Have you heard of her?
Mhm.
Okay, you should read that.
Mhm.
Interesting. It was written in about 1992, 93. She is a Cameroonian, but from Senegalese and French
Yeah.
nationality. And the title of the book, What If Africa Refused Development?
Oh, yeah, okay. I think I've heard of that, but I've
Okay.
not read it.
Oh,
Yes.
it's not an academic research
Sure,
book, it's
sure.
a pamphlet.
Yeah, sure.
In fact, what she wants to do is
Yeah,
slap in the face, wake up, you can do better.
yeah.
Okay, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And I have that sense tremendously. And I felt that in the forced settlement, many ministers. And the one thing I heard so many times was, I often go for working sessions in Quebec, in Ottawa, and I was then in West Africa. And, when you discuss with people for a whole day, you get a sense of who they are.
Yeah.
And they said, I have a sense that the people in front of me are there to work for the good, not everybody, but they work for the good of Canada. And all the ministers would tell me, I don't have anyone in my ministry out there who works for the benefit of the country. They work for them and their family.
Yeah, often.
So that has tremendous repercussions
Yeah, I know.
in what happens. So what you say demonstrate away, but like the first question you had, you say, how do you explain that? And that is something that has been in a way haunting me, because
Yeah.
when I go to South Africa, I see so many Black people who are tremendously capable.
Oh, Nigeria, you see it.
Same thing.
Night and
But
every
in
day.
fact, you
Every day.
reach the level over there of the South African economy a
Yeah.
couple years
Yeah,
ago.
yeah, exactly.
Now it's on a par.
Yeah.
And I think if it keeps going the way, it may just really
yeah,
take
yeah.
off, because
Do you
South
take any
Africa.
interest in Cornell West? And, well, when you're
Yeah.
talking about the apartheid, I think he used that word as a kind of a second apartheid after the real well, the slavery in the United States.
Yeah,
He sort of said the
Yeah.
mentality of his people, the chocolate people, he calls them, are still caught mentally in the bind
Yeah.
of
Yeah, if I
white
can
superiority.
very quickly just make a couple comments, because you guys both gave me really important and good things to think about. So I'll start here. So, the US is really different from almost every other country that I write about in the book. And there's maybe 10 or 12 pages on the United States right at the end, just because it's a big and important country that I can't completely ignore. But what's unusual in the US is that you had a system where the US Constitution itself protected slavery, slave owners, and states' rights. And so once slavery itself was abolished during the Reconstruction period, you had a short window of time where the US is going through similar kinds of reforms that were happening in the Caribbean, but that all gets overturned. Like once the state governments begin to reassert themselves vis-a-vis the federal government.
What he calls Jane and Jim Crow.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
after the 1880s, like the type of legislation that you get of anti-Black discriminatory legislation that you get in the United States, it doesn't have any parallel anywhere else in the Americas. The only other country that is more extreme than that is South Africa. But in the rest of the Americas, you don't have the type of, you don't have anti-miscegenation laws, for instance, you don't have legalized residential segregation. You don't have this business of white only juries in a jury system. And so there are all kinds of built-in institutional mechanisms that keep emancipated Afro-descendants as second-class citizens in the United States that were more rigorous than in other parts of the Americas, where the exclusion was more informal and less written into law like it was in the United States. So that's my very quick thought about that. And then over here, one of the things I didn't really talk about, which is discussed in the book, which is I think important and relevant, is that in forced settlement colonies, usually slavery was abolished at a period of significant economic decline. And some of that decline was precipitated by abolition, but some of it was just the consequence of industrialization of Europe and the shift away from, like, what used to be valuable for the Europeans was the sugar and the coffee and the cocoa from the Caribbean. And now what became valuable was like the gold and the diamonds from Africa and the palm oil from West Africa and copper and things that are industrial raw materials, right? So where Europeans make money shifted fundamentally from like the Caribbean and India fundamentally in like the 18th century to like India and sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of Asia in the 19th century. And so those forced settlement territories, in a sense, were lucky that they became, from the colonial powers perspective, they almost became like economic backwaters. And all of their economies went into a serious crisis for about 30 years. And so by the end of the 19th century, once their plantations were no longer profitable, and the British and the French had to figure out how to stabilize the economies in these systems, they tended to build up school systems and make them more inclusive as a way of like creating a different kind of economy, something new. And they also shifted the base of even agriculture away from things like sugar that can only be grown in large estates with repressive labor to things like bananas, right? That you can have like 10 banana trees on a small plot of land as a small Black free family, but you can't do that with sugar. So like once the economy shifts like that, there's more incentive of the colonial authorities to support those sectors of the economy that are actually controlled by mixed race often and black, like free people, as opposed to those large plantations that were mostly bankrupt anyway by the end of the 19th century. So whereas in Africa, all the money was in extractive things that Europeans owned at the turn of the 20th century. And so that's why they set up state structures that were a lot more both labor repressive, but also exclusionary in terms of like who owned the mining companies and the whatever, the rubber plantations and things like that that were being developed in, say, equatorial Africa, right? It was just fundamentally different from what was going on in whatever, Cabo Verde or Mauritius or Trinidad or Jamaica at that, by that point in their history. So it's 2:00, but I'm happy to chat with you guys informally.
No, we see.
Yeah, we can, yes, we can have
Do we have anybody online who want to ask the question? Nobody there. Maybe I should just ask this question that I always pose to my students about the counterfaction. What would have been if there's no colonialism?
Jeez, that's a wonderful question.
And to also link it to the current debate on what the colonial scholars call coloniality, that continue to feed on the division that he mentioned, that the transnational capitalist elite continue to also play the post-colonial elite against their own people.
Absolutely, 100%.
So
Yeah.
how will you respond to that?
It's an excellent question. So what would have happened without colonialism? So, one thing that is really clear is that the slave trade completely decimated Africa's population and its human capital potential, and it destroyed most of the prosperous, powerful African states that might have emerged into something by 1900, clearly. So the kind of depopulation of the continent, scholars kind of assume that Africa would have had twice the population in 1900 if it hadn't been for the slave trade, between the slave trades in plural.
Yeah, it
between
was the
1500
Eastern one.
Yeah, 'cause it was, yeah. And also the wars that were generated in Africa, the wars that were fought on African soil to generate captives to sell into slavery, many of those conflicts probably wouldn't have happened if the Americas hadn't been colonized the way that they were. And so Africa itself would have entered the modern age probably more in a closer position to how a country like, I don't know, maybe Thailand or Japan entered the modern age. Like those parts of Asia weren't really.
But Thailand was never colonized. It was between the two.
That's my whole point. It was, those parts of Asia were never kind of subjected to the very extractive aspects of European imperialism that even, say, China was, because like China proper was never colonized, but it was absolutely destroyed by European imperial kind of intrigues in the 18th and 19th century and set back a long time. Like Japan less so, right? And I know a lot less about Asia than I do about Africa, so I don't want to, I don't feel comfortable sort of taking this point too far. But Africa would have developed more states that would have been in a better, that would have entered the modern age on a more even playing field relative to Western countries, because like they were already there in 1500s when the Europeans first showed up. Clearly, they weren't by 1900, right? So that time period, even though it's not colonial in the way that colonial would look after 1900, right? It's imperial, but it's not yet colonial in the way that it would look later, is a really kind of like a turning point that was extremely destructive in ways that I don't think have been fully studied and fleshed out yet. So
Thank you.
yeah.
the one thing that would have always been a problem, I think, in Africa is that wherever I've worked, there's always what I saw, the conflict between the farmers and the cattle herders.
Oh,
Land
sure.
conflict. And in
Sure.
fact, it was tied to the slave trade because that was one way to get rid of the other one. That, and especially I did a fair amount of work in Sub-Sahel where land is quite an issue. And
Yeah, and you see that play out in a lot of.
I have
different
seen
countries
it
all
play
over
out
Africa.
so strongly,
A lot
it really is true. So I think that would have been a major issue.
think you're right.
And another issue that came to mind, do you know Thomas so well?
No.
Okay, he's quite old now, he may be 93, 94, he's a black academic, a guy that thinks like nobody else, he likes to, he wrote books, do you know him?
I know the work. I know.
Okay, he wrote books against intellectuals, essentially. He says he fears intellectual, he's an academic, because he thinks that he says he was raised in the Bronx, and when he remembers his younger age and his friends, he says, we never thought we were less capable or something like that. We just know I'm gonna work hard and I'm gonna make it. And I made it and my friends made it. But then later we came with all those intellectual about the struggles and all those things. And now we have many of the black people who think, why should I try? The whole system is rigged against me. And he says it plays on the mind, it plays on everything.
Yeah.
And so,
It can.
you know, he will argue that point very strongly. And another point he argued about Africa to try to explain its almost exclusion of the whole of Africa of the big trade, because there was a big slave trade, but he says at the same time is that you don't have good rivers in Africa.
The geography.
The geography,
Yeah,
because
is
you look at
quite
West
against you,
Africa,
yeah.
you could not have the big ships go there. There's no place. South Africa has it. I just came back
Yeah,
from
they
Port
do.
Elizabeth, in Cape Town and all those places. But
Absolutely.
West Africa did not have, but they had it enough for the slave trade though. That needs to
Thank
be
you very
said.
much.
You're very welcome.
Let's give him a round of applause again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Your questions are great.
So, do you want to?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, we'd like to note that the next seminar will be on March 20th. And then the title is Restoring African Studies Pedagogies, Exploring the Potential of Epistemic Decolonization to Nurture. And it's going to be given by Nathan Andrews, one of our colleagues
Master University.
from McMaster University. It promises to be another very exciting one, and we hope that you can join us. And if you're not already on our mailing list, please do email us and we can add you on the mailing list. We send out information on seminars like this and other activities of the Institute. So that keeps you abreast of what's going on here. And you can choose what events or what lectures that you want to attend.
Yeah.
We don't always do this, but Kunle has come all the way from the United States, and we are so blessed to have you here today.
Thank you so much.
And we have a small present to make in appreciation of your coming to our institute.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. This has been a real pleasure getting to know you guys.
Oh,
and
yes.
I hope to come back.
And there's faculty,
I hope so. Yeah.
and faculty are doing exciting stuff. You might want to check out Kathy's work. And
I
there's
will.
a lot of you're going to find some of our colleagues who are also doing interesting work.
Yes.
We have a Latin American and a Caribbean studies program.
Oh, cool.
As
Yes.
well.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice.
Blacks, that our colleague
Is it in this building?
no, but I mean they're our sister unit. So
I find it very, very
the
interesting.
coordinator of the
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Please,
So-
take a picture.
Oh, okay. So
Thank you.
Samuel, do you want-
Yeah.
That's nice.
So, all right. So let's have you in the middle.
Yeah.
Sure. Kunle in the
Oh, you
middle.
want me in the middle? Sure. Absolutely.
And then we have everyone join us.
Cheese. Okay, and the
Thank
rest
you.
of the people as well?
Just so we give him more memories to take.
Yeah.
from us.